Greetings and hello, everybody. We are once again here to continue on with our lovely learning endeavors. And today what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take what we started learning just the other day about imperialism that was taking place in Asia, and now we're going to take a look at how it's being affected throughout the rest of the world. So today we're going to be taking a look at an area called Latin America. So obviously we are sticking to the Americas here, both North and South America, so the Caribbean, Mexico, and then many of the regions in South America specifically. So what I need you guys to be doing is making sure that you are jotting down everything that you need for this lesson. Now, one thing that I definitely want to address before I get going is that I've got a couple of emails from students asking, hey, can I write down all of this stuff instead of putting it into a Google document? And to that I say, guys, whatever is going to help you retain information the best, I am all for it. So if you want to write your notes down into a piece of paper and then send them to me through Google Classroom, I'm all for it. So please make sure that you're feeling free to do that. All right, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and let's jump into our first slide. So the first portion of this is going to be centering around what's called the Spanish-American War. So up to this point, the United States has been around for a while. We've gone through our Civil War, and we're trying to take part in some of this imperialism that has been going on all throughout the world. We want our piece of the economic pie. And up to this point, one place where we were starting to really establish some of our economic ties was that of Cuba. So Cuba becomes incredibly, incredibly important here. Okay? Cuba. Important. So the reason why this place is so important is because it has sugarcane. Okay, so sugarcane becomes a huge investment for us. Now, at this point, Cuba is actually owned by Spain. So Spain is the country that is running the show at that point, even though many of the Cubans want freedom, and even though a good portion of the wealth on that island is actually owned by Americans. So there's a gentleman by the name of Jose Marti. Now, Jose Marti is fighting for the Cuban people. He wants to lead a revolt. He wants to get independence for Cuba as a whole. Now, the Spanish, of course, as this bloodshed is happening, they want to make sure that nobody is going to continue to rise up. So they respond brutally to that rebellion. So they do what they can in order to stop it from continuing. That includes taking people prisoner and executing them with really little to no due process. So they're not getting a court case. They're being put into concentration camps and prisoner camps, and they're being treated incredibly poorly. Of course, the Spanish are trying to say, hey, don't rise up against us. Okay, so that's how they're getting their point across. Now, as far as America is concerned, the question is, well, what do we have to do with this? To a certain extent, we wanted Cuba to have their freedom because that was going to allow us to really put ourselves and establish ourselves as an influential force within Cuba. Now, initially, there wasn't enough sentiment at home against the Spanish in order for us to really get involved. But what we did start to notice, and what some of the newspaper reporters were starting to really make clear, is that it was very dangerous in Cuba at that point. And, of course, a lot of the media was siding with the Cuban people. They wanted them to be able to get their freedom. So the narrative was that we should help. However, America doesn't really enter very easily into war. So they didn't have the backing of all the people. They didn't really have the backing of Congress. And so we continued to kind of work and do our thing, but we wanted to get our people out of there. We wanted to take them out of danger, especially because some of the collateral damage up to that point was starting to become American. So we wanted to get our people out. And so they sent this ship right here, the USS Maine. Now, as you can see from this picture, it's a little bit troubling with what's going on here with the Maine. See, as we were attempting to evacuate all of our people, evacuate troops, and get all of our financial investments taken off the island, boom, the USS Maine explodes. Now, this is kind of a turning point for us because before, the people were against the Spanish, but we didn't have enough support in order for us to go full on into war. Now we do. There were citizens of ours, obviously, and investments of ours that were on that ship, and as it exploded, well, that gave us a little bit more incentive to move. Now, the more interesting thing about this is that we never really got any serious confirmation about who actually planted the explosives, who actually exploded the ship as a whole. And so because of that, we really kind of went with what the media said. And the media, again, was very much against the Spanish, and they wanted to get us involved. And so we listened. Even though we didn't necessarily have that specific evidence, we listened because the media blamed it on the Spanish. So with that, we declare war. So the Spanish-American War was fought primarily in the Caribbean region. Now, we're not going to get into too many details of that specific war. You guys will hear a little bit more about that next year when you guys are in American history. But when we talk about this imperialism, this is what we're really getting into, is that now the United States, they had a new navy, and they started pushing their rule and kind of pushing their influence all throughout Cuba, because once that war was over, we didn't necessarily take over Cuba, but we had the ability legally to be able to go in there and intervene whenever we wanted. So the United States really was kind of drawing a bit of a line in the sand here. They started to say, hey, these Latin American countries, the Latin American interests are ours. So we rule over this area, essentially. And if anybody else wants to come and do anything, well, there could be some hell to pay if it were to come to that. And we'll talk more about that here on the next slide. But one of the things that we needed to establish as having the power and the influence over the region is we needed to be able to move our troops and our ships incredibly quickly. Now, the problem was, geographically, we had an entire continent in our way. So if we had to get our ships, let's say from the east coast of the United States or down in the Caribbean, if we wanted to get them over to the Pacific Ocean, if we wanted to go bring them to California, right now we're looking at a situation with the coronavirus that is saying, hey, we need to have ships, in New York. We need to have ships in San Diego, LA, San Francisco. Okay, and they're deploying their ships in order to get there. Now, the problem is in order to get there, you would have to sail them all the way underneath South America, and that could take a very, very long time. So what the United States wanted to do is they wanted to make sure that there was easy access back and forth on either side. So there was a little chunk of land in Central America called Panama. So as you can see from the picture here, we have at least part of the Panama Canal. So this is what's going to allow us to move very quickly back and forth. Now, the problem was that this was a big endeavor. The good news was, though, that the French had actually started this entire process for us. So they had begun the process. They had been constructing for a handful of years up to that point. The problem was that they weren't making any meaningful headway. The people were getting killed because of a rebellion that was taking place, but also, even beyond that, mosquitoes, malaria, disease was kind of making it difficult for the French to do their thing, to the point where they decided that they were going to kind of cut their losses. America was interested, and they're going to come in and they're going to sell that to America. Okay, so with the rebellion that was going on in Panama, Roosevelt actually supported the rebellion. You see, at this point, we had Panama being ruled by Colombia. And so these rebels were fighting against Colombia in order to gain independence for Panama. With us supporting Panama, that kind of gave them what they needed in order to take that, because now we don't have to fight against Colombia in order to get this land for Panama. Made it a little easier for us. So we're granted control of the canal by the French. We end up finishing the Panama Canal, and that connects both of these oceans together. The way that this works, you guys can see right here on the picture, we've got the ship right here. Now, the ship is going to be sailing all the way into these little chambers. So these chambers, we can get a better color here for it. These are called locks. Okay, so they will go into here. Once they get into this region, this door right here will shut, and then the water will raise up until it's even with this one. So you guys can kind of see there's a little bit of a difference in height. Once it's done raising up, they're going to go into this one, same deal. Going to go into that one, same deal. And then finally, they get here and they can go along their merry way. Okay, so they have these on each side of the Panama Canal because this land is actually elevated from the actual canal itself. Or, I'm sorry, from the oceans themselves. So they had to find a way to make sure that the ships could actually sail through there and keeping the water inside. So these locks allow them to do just that. So Theodore Roosevelt, the president of the United States at that point, he wants to expand American involvement in Latin America. So up to that point, Europe had actually been very, very involved. Remember, when we were talking about European exploration, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they were really, let's call it proficient in taking land within Central and in Latin America. Because of that, a lot of the business that many of these nations had done with the Spanish and with the Portuguese and with the British, okay, they had a lot of money that they actually owed to those countries. Okay, now, Theodore Roosevelt, he wanted to get all of those countries really out of Latin America. And so he puts forth what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. Pretty much what this said was, if you are trying to come into our territory, if you are trying to get involved in these governments, diplomatically, economically, whatever the case may be, if you're interfering in any way, we will respond with force. So we drew the line in the sand. We said, this is ours. This is no longer yours. We're going to deal with all of these countries from now on. So what does that mean for the countries that were owed money by these Latin American states? Well, what they did is they used a concept called dollar diplomacy. More or less what this was a way of saying that the United States were going to take on their debts. So they end up investing $3.5 billion of development within the Latin American countries, which is awesome. Because what happens is that now all that money that they owed, that the Latin American countries owed to these European countries, the United States paid it off. So they swooped in, they essentially helped them with their loan. They paid off their loan. But now instead of owing that money to Europe, they now owed it to the United States. And so that allowed us to get in and kind of say, hey, we're going to take, X amount of money from your exports, and that will keep us on track to get paid off. So the United States is doing a pretty effective job with their imperialism without having to go in and invade and trying to rule over another country. Instead, they're just aligning themselves economically and getting into the wealth of that nation in order to make money off of them. So the United States, getting themselves involved with these Latin American countries, there was actually some pretty big benefit to it. There was an economic boom. Okay, these countries now, at the very least, had one guaranteed buyer. And that, of course, was the United States. Okay, they had stuff like wheat, beef, coffee, sugar, silver. Okay, all of this is leading to a time of prosperity because the United States is buying all of these goods from them. Okay, they traded for textiles, so they got cloths, curtains, clothings, drapes, carpets, and so on. Machines, so now they were able to industrialize a little bit more. And luxury items, of course. They wanted nice clothing, nice goods for their friends, for their family, and so on. Okay, so all in all, there was a lot of cash that was being brought in to these Latin American countries. Okay, now, industrialization certainly increases, but they remain economically dependent on Western nations as a whole. Okay, so all of their goods not all of them, most of their goods are still coming from the Western civilizations. Okay, Latin America remains underdeveloped for a long time. Okay, by the time we get to 1888, slavery is finally abolished, and so that kind of is a good thing and a bad thing as far as their money is concerned. Okay, good thing. Obviously, we don't want people enslaved. That's not exactly the right thing to do. People were treated poorly and so on. But for those people that were utilizing slaves for harvesting, for labor, for getting their goods, it was a bit of a downside because now they had to pay everybody to do their work. Okay, so some people were not very thrilled about having to do that. Now, a lot of the indigenous people, the people that actually lived within the land, they're poverty-stricken. Okay, so a lot of folks that are coming in are making a good portion of that money. Okay, so folks are immigrating to these different countries because they see that opportunity to help with getting more raw materials, to get more money because of harvesting those raw materials. And on our last slide here today, we're just going to kind of talk about what were some of these effects. What were some of the things that happened because of this? Okay, Latin America looks to the U.S. as a model for industrialization. They see all of the amazing goods that we're creating, and they want to do the exact same thing. Okay, they also sought liberal reform. What that means is that they want to make sure that their people have very specific rights. They want to change things. The entire idea of liberalism is to kind of look forward, to change the status quo, to look out for other people. Now, sometimes it's effective, sometimes it's unfortunately not. In this case, they're looking to make sure that everybody is kind of treated with specific kind of human rights that we talked about during the Enlightenment. Okay, we see middle sectors grow. So a lot of these jobs like lawyers and merchants and teachers, military officers, they grow in numbers. So there's starting to be less of a gap between the super rich and the poor. Now there's folks that can kind of live in that middle area, that middle class, and make a decent living throughout their lives. Now, immigration. Okay, we still, of course, obviously deal with immigration coming into the United States today, but believe it or not, during this period, we had people wanting to go not just to the United States, but into Argentina and into some of these Latin American countries because there were a lot of opportunities to make money, a lot of opportunities for jobs, and a lot of room to be an entrepreneur. Okay, so if you wanted to get in there and create a factory and create these raw materials or manufactured materials out of the raw materials, you had a nice chance of being successful. Whereas if you came to the United States, you might be little more than white noise, meaning you're not going to have too much of an effect or have that much success. So a lot of people started moving down into Argentina and other areas within South America. Okay, again, 3 million immigrants. That's pretty darn big. Okay, so that's going to do it for our PowerPoint for today. Okay, so as we will continue to do, make sure that you are looking in Google Classroom and that you answer the questions and the vocab terms and, of course, summarize this lesson in there. Remember, guys, your summary should be somewhere around 4 sentences, and they should be well thought out and robust, okay? I think we've all kind of been there where we haven't had a very great summary. So I challenge you guys to really push a little bit harder. Give me a good idea of everything that we talked about within just the course of a few sentences. All right, so that's what we've got for today, ladies and gentlemen. We will continue on with a little bit more of this as we continue on this week. We're almost there. You guys have made it through to Wednesday, so let's just keep on pushing through. We're going to get to the end of the week here before we know it, and we're going to get used to our new status quo very soon. All right, guys. So with that all done and out of the way, please let me know if you guys need anything. My email is always open. Some of you guys have already reached out and touched base with me, and that's really awesome, and I appreciate that. So go ahead and continue to do that. Until then, I will see you guys on the next time. Have a good rest of your day.